What did the founders mean by separation of church and state? There is a phrase we hear constantly in American public life: separation of church and state. It appears in debates, in court decisions, in social media arguments, and often it is used to suggest that faith should stay private, somewhere behind the walls of a church building. But before we argue about the phrase, it helps to slow down and ask a simpler question. Where did it actually come from? Because the phrase itself does not appear in the Constitution. The First Amendment uses different language. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Two ideas: no national church and no interference with the practice of religion. That wording mattered deeply to the generation that wrote it. Many of them had seen what happened when governments controlled churches. In England, there was the Church of England, closely tied to political power. In parts of Europe, rulers could dictate religious life. People could be taxed to support churches they did not belong to, or pressured to conform. So when the American founders drafted the First Amendment, they were trying to avoid those problems. They wanted religious liberty. The famous phrase most people quote today actually comes from a letter written in 1802 by Thomas Jefferson. A group called the Danbury Baptists had written to him with a concern. They were a small religious minority in Connecticut where the Congregational Church still had a privileged legal position. They worried about government interference in religion. Jefferson responded with reassurance. He wrote that the First Amendment had built, in his words, a wall of separation between church and state. Now, that phrase stuck. But the context matters. Jefferson was describing a boundary that prevented the federal government from controlling religious institutions. In other words, the wall was meant to limit the power of the state. When we look at the broader founding era, we see something interesting. Many leaders at the time believed that religion still played an important role in shaping public virtue. George Washington once wrote that religion and morality were important supports for political life. John Adams argued that the Constitution depended on a people capable of self-government. Their point was not that the government should run churches. In fact, the First Amendment prevented that. But they believed that the character of a nation ultimately depended on the character of its citizens. And citizens draw their moral convictions from somewhere. This is where the conversation becomes deeper than slogans, because every society rests on moral assumptions. Ideas about justice, ideas about human dignity, ideas about what is right and wrong. Those ideas do not come from nowhere. And when citizens bring those moral convictions into public debate, they are doing what people in every democracy eventually do: reasoning together about the common good. The founders tried to create a system that allowed exactly that. Government would not control religion, but religious belief would also not be erased from public life. Instead, a free people would debate moral questions openly, guided by their deepest convictions. That balance is not always easy, but it is important. Because if government becomes the highest authority in a society, then politics eventually becomes the final judge of right and wrong. But if there are moral principles higher than government itself, then political power has limits. And historically, that belief has often protected liberty rather than threatened it. So when we hear the phrase separation of church and state, it helps to remember the original concern behind it. The founders were trying to protect religious freedom while also allowing citizens to reason openly about moral questions. They were limiting government power, not eliminating moral debate. That distinction matters because healthy democracies depend on citizens who can discuss the foundations of their shared life together, carefully, thoughtfully, without slogans doing all the work. And perhaps that is a good reminder for our moment. Before repeating phrases we have heard 1,000 times, it may be worth pausing long enough to ask what they meant in the first place. Clarity does not solve every disagreement, but it is usually the first step towards understanding.